Hey folks, and welcome to another edition of Zog Science. We're going to be continuing our talk about animal transport by getting into the topic of gas exchange. So you're going to need respiratory surfaces in order for gas exchange to occur with the environment, because that's where all the gas is. And there are three requirements. Number one, it's got to be a moist surface. Number two, it's got to have contact with the circulatory system and the environment. And then number three, it's going to have a large surface area, which, as we've seen, is a trend that in a lot of these different systems. There's a lot of different variety in terms of how this can occur, so we're going to take a look at several of those systems. So the first one is gills, which are found in fish, crustaceans, and sea stars. This is where exchange of gas occurs between water and the circulatory system, not between air and the circulatory system. So water is going to move over the gills, and as it does so, O2 and CO2 are going to be diffusing out. And the way that it does so is with the use of countercurrent. This is an adaptation that is only found in fish. It's a really cool adaptation because what it does is it maximizes the efficiency of the system and ensures that there's always going to be a higher concentration of oxygen in the water compared to the blood. And the way that this occurs is that as the blood is moving along in the opposite direction as the water starts off with a high concentration, the blood starts off with a low concentration. The water is going to be diffusing the oxygen gas continuously into the blood. So the blood is going to be slowly increasing in concentration, meaning that the most concentrated blood is going to be at the part where there is the most concentrated water, which makes sense because now there's still going to be enough partial pressure of oxygen in the water in order to diffuse into the blood. And as the water continues to flow down, it always has a higher partial pressure of water, of oxygen, than the blood does. Therefore, diffusion is going to continue to occur all along the way, maximizing the efficiency of the system, which is really cool, and shows how nature is all about really increasing efficiency. So some other examples besides gills are trachea. These are found in insects. Here, air enters through openings in the exoskeleton that are called spiracles. As the air then enters in to the trachea, it is kind of moved through various tubes into the body where it is exchanged with cells, and then the air just kind of finds its way back out through other spiracles and kind of moves in and moves out. And that is how they are able to facilitate gas exchange. There are also some specialized lungs, which are found in birds, and they have a one-way circulatory system, or one-way respiratory system, where they can breathe in. That is going to put air into a posterior air sac, and that posterior air sac kind of holds the air for a little bit. As it does so, it pushes. That is going to move air from the lungs into the anterior air sac, but that pulls some air along with it. And then as they breathe out, they then bring more new air into the lungs. And so what this does is it allows birds to maintain constantly oxygenated air within their lungs. And this is important for birds because they have much higher energy demands than a lot of other organisms because of flight. Flight demands a lot of energy, and so the birds have to consistently be keeping oxygenated air within their lungs. Now we are going to be using the human system, the human respiratory system, as our kind of model, as we have been doing with a lot of other systems. And this is just kind of a layout of the respiratory system. So you've got either your nasal passages or your mouth in order to bring in air. And then kind of the first other organ or section, I guess, of the respiratory system is the larynx. This is where the voice box is. Then you've got the trachea, which is going to carry the air down into the lungs. These are the bronchus, which is the kind of the bronchi, which are these two main large pathways. Kind of think of them like arteries, like more specifically maybe like the aorta, something like that. A very large vascular tissue that's going to help transport air. And then it kind of breaks down and eventually gets into little alveolus, and we're going to get into what those are. And then you've got the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a muscle, and that muscle helps to facilitate the process of breathing. We'll discuss that process in just a little bit. So as the air gets pushed down into the lungs, or rather pulled down into the lungs, the air fills up these little cavities known as alveoli. And the whole point of alveoli is to increase surface area. So the alveoli are surrounded by capillaries. So as the oxygen-rich gas, the air fills these alveoli. They're surrounded by all these capillaries. O2, CO2, and other gases are exchanged by diffusion, and that's as the air and the blood move past one another. So you can see here the alveoli with all the little capillaries surrounding the outside. And you can see those under a scanning electron microscope here. Now, how does breathing actually occur? Well, the breathing occurs as the diaphragm contracts, it moves down. And as it moves down, it is going to increase the volume of the body cavity. And as it does that, it is going to cause a decrease in pressure. Why? You now have a larger volume, so the pressure is going to decrease. What that does is it pulls in air from the surroundings, from the environment. Then, when you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes. This causes the body cavity to decrease. As the body cavity decreases in volume, that creates higher pressure, so it pushes the air out of your lungs. That is how breathing works. It's all about creating a negative pressure that pulls air in, and then when you breathe out, it sends it back out. Now, how does this actual gas exchange process work? Well, we have erythrocytes, which remember are the red blood cells, and they're full of hemoglobin. They actually don't have a nucleus, and that's to maximize the amount of hemoglobin that they can fit inside. Hemoglobin has an affinity for 4 different gases: oxygen, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and nitrous oxide. Obviously, we want it to be binding to oxygen and CO2 in order to help move oxygen and CO2 throughout our bodies. However, it actually has a higher affinity for carbon monoxide than for oxygen, which is why you can get something like carbon monoxide poisoning. And that's why you should probably think about, if you have a furnace or something like that, having a carbon monoxide sensor, so that if carbon monoxide levels get too high, you can get out of the house. Because the problem is that carbon monoxide binds to your hemoglobin, prevents oxygen from binding to it, and you can suffocate even if there is plenty of oxygen in the air around you. But anyway, so what happens is that there are these iron molecules that are attached to a heme group inside the protein of the hemoglobin itself, and that's where the oxygen or the carbon monoxide bond. CO2 and NO are binding allosterically, so they're binding in other sites. They don't actually prevent oxygen or nitrous oxide, or they don't prevent oxygen or CO or carbon monoxide from binding, but carbon monoxide binds at the iron heme group, preventing oxygen from binding. So gases move from areas of high to low partial pressure. We've seen this before, right? It's just like moving from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So in the alveolus, which is the singular for an alveoli, there's the high partial pressure of oxygen. There's a lower partial pressure of oxygen in the capillaries themselves. So the water moves, so the oxygen moves into the blood. And then once it gets to the cells, the body tissues have a lower partial pressure. So now the oxygen moves out into the rest of the cells. Carbon dioxide works the exact opposite way. Carbon dioxide has a higher partial pressure in the body tissue than it does in the circulatory system. Circulatory system then goes to the alveolus. Higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the circulatory system now than there is in the alveolus. So it drops off the carbon dioxide in your alveolus, and then you breathe it out. Now, the way that CO2 actually kind of gets moved around is a little different. It can certainly bind to the hemoglobin. However, that's not the primary way that it moves around. It actually turns into HCO3, bicarbonate, and that bicarbonate ion is very important because in the blood plasma, it works as a buffer, and it helps to maintain a slightly basic pH around -7.4. And if you were to get outside of that range, from about 6.8 to about 7.8, then you would actually die. So it's very important that we have this bicarbonate buffer in order to help make sure that we survive. And why does that need to be? Well, all of the proteins and other enzymes and things that are in our blood, they require a certain pH in order to do their thing. So it's pretty good that we've got this system built in where we maintain proper CO2 levels within our body. You tend to not necessarily think about the fact that you need CO2 in your body, but in fact, you do. So the control of the system is both voluntary and involuntary, right? I can hold my breath for a certain amount of time, but eventually this is going to start to decrease the amount of O2 in my body, as well as increase the level of CO2, right? Because I'm never pulling in more oxygen. I'm not breathing out any more CO2. So eventually what's going to happen is that I'm going to start to get signals that are going to pop up in my aorta and my carotid artery. And those are going to sense the fact that the CO2 levels are rising. And it's going to send a signal to either the medulla oblongata or also the pons, which is kind of part of the brain stem. And that's going to tell it to start increasing breathing rates. And you're going to see those types of things happen when you are exercising, right? As you exercise, you're going to produce more and more CO2. So therefore, you're going to begin breathing faster and faster. As CO2 levels begin to decrease, that is going to send a stimulus that you have now a decrease in the need to breathe, and then you will breathe more slowly. We'll talk about two different problems that you can have with your respiratory system. First one is asthma, and this is where your bronchioles are going to be constricting, and it can be triggered by several different events. Whether it's an environmental thing, like maybe some sort of pollen or something like that, or you can have exercise-induced asthma, several different ways, but the gist of it is that your bronchioles constrict, and they also produce a little more mucus, and that excess mucus helps to clog up the bronchioles, and therefore you are going to have a lot of trouble breathing, feel shortness of breath, feel like you can't ever really get a breath in. That's because you just can't get the airflow that you need. There's medication that can help to relieve the symptoms, as well as help prevent asthma attacks from occurring. The other one is emphysema. This is a decrease in alveolar surface area, which is obviously going to be bad because you want as much surface area as possible in order to facilitate oxygen exchange. Usually this is caused by environmental factors. It can be caused by maybe, working in a mine and getting a lot of dust into your lungs. It can also be caused by smoking, things like that. You can kind of see here the difference between a healthy lung and a unhealthy lung. You can see that there's a lot of kind of large irregular air sacs. You notice that it's kind of discolored. Can be that it may be sort of calcified, so maybe more rigid, less spongy than it should be. So you can also see that the blood vessels here are much smaller than the blood vessels as they should be. There aren't really many treatments for emphysema. You can take in oxygen, concentrated oxygen, to help overcome the fact that you don't have as much surface area as you should. But unfortunately, there's just not a lot you can do. The lungs are a really sensitive organ, and they need to be taken care of. So don't smoke. But anyways, thanks for watching. That's all we're going to do when we talk about transport. Next up on the list is immunity. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.